fantastic. I'd like to thank our sponsors for helping to fund this event and make this event possible. In particular, I would like to thank Connect, Nissan, and MTSU for their sponsorship of this event. I'd like to introduce to you, yay! I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker, Curtis Chen. He is the co-founder of the Asian American Writers Workshop in New York City. He served as the nonprofit's first executive director. He went on to write for television before transitioning to social justice documentaries. Chen has screened his films in over 600 venues in 16 countries. His essays have appeared in Bon Appetit and the Emancipation/Boston Globe. A graduate of the University of Michigan and former visiting scholar at New York University, Chen has received awards from ABC, Disney Television, New York Foundation for the Arts, National Endowment for the Arts, and more. He can be found at curtisfromdetroit.com. Today, Mr. Chen is going to be speaking to us or reading an excerpt from his upcoming memoir and talking about his experience with coming of age and coming out in Detroit during the 1980s. And I am personally looking forward to this. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Chen to the stage.
Hi, thank you, Shay. Thank you to Will, and thank you to all the organizers of the conference. I've really enjoyed my time here so far and learned a lot from the panels yesterday and this morning. So, sorry, I keep fidgeting with this thing. All right. Okay. So, so thank you again for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey as a writer, and then I'll read an excerpt from my upcoming memoir called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. As the title implies, I grew up in a Chinese restaurant in Detroit, and not just any Chinese restaurant. This was actually what I like to think of as the best Chinese food in Detroit. And the way I sort of stake my claim to that is that I asked people to guess, how many egg rolls do you think we sold in the course of 60 years that we owned the restaurant? So if there are any math majors here, feel free to take a stab. Just throw out a number if you want. Anybody? Whoa, no. Okay. All right. Tough crowd here. No, actually, it's closer to 10 million, which is still pretty good, you know, considering that they were all handmade by my grandma, even the skin and even the sauce. And so that was my childhood growing up in this really, really wonderful restaurant. And I actually thought that was going to be my future, right? I mean, it was a really popular restaurant. My family was all there. We had a nice color TV in the back, which we could watch. We could eat all the free food that we wanted. And to me, I just pictured myself inheriting the restaurant like my dad had inherited from his dad and his dad inherited from him. But it was when I reached high school that I started thinking that maybe there was something else out there for me, right? Outside of just working in the restaurant. And that was because of two things that happened, sort of two current events. The first was the Vincent Chin murder in Detroit. I don't know how many people here are familiar with that case. Is anybody here familiar with it? Okay, one person. I don't know if you're loud enough to shout or if you want me to just explain what it's about. Okay. So this is during the 80s, during the height of the anti-Japanese automobile sentiment in the country. In Detroit, which was really a one industry town, it was really, really suffering because for the first time, the Japanese had surpassed the United States as the largest auto producer in the world. People were losing their jobs, losing their homes. And there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment because of that. And even though we were Chinese and not Japanese, we felt a lot of the backlash, this sense of, oh my God, you know, how are people looking at us differently? You know, our worst fears sort of came about when one of our family friends, a guy named Vincent Chin, was out celebrating his upcoming wedding. And at some point, these two white auto workers come in and they're overheard saying it's because of you mother blanks that we're out of work. And they take a baseball bat and they bash this guy's head in. And to make matters worse, the judge only fined them $3,000. They never served a single day in jail. And to us, as a community, we'd always trusted law enforcement. We just thought like, oh, okay, well, if you kill someone, you're going to go to jail. And it just really, really made us evaluate where we sat in society. Even though my family had been in Detroit since the 1800s, we started to realize that maybe some people will always perceive us as being foreigners. And so it was a really, really, eye-opening moment in my life. And as I say in my book, he wasn't the first person I knew to be murdered because Detroit was pretty violent. I knew 5 people that had been murdered by the time I was 18. He wasn't the first person I knew to be murdered, and nor would he be the last. But his death was the one that probably had the biggest impact on me growing up because it was so connected to racial identity. The second event that sort of impacted my childhood growing up was AIDS, right? As a child of the 80s, just coming out of the closet, trying to figure out my sexuality, I was really, really curious about this disease that people were starting to talk about, like on the coast, and how that might affect me. And I really tried to search the papers for as many stories I could find. Very, very little was written, and usually not on the front page. Similarly, with the Vincent Chin story, which was happening around the same time, I was trying to find stories about the Vincent Chin case, right, and his perspective. But instead, most of the stories seemed to be about the white auto workers and the difficulties they were going through. And for the first time in my life, I thought like, well, okay, who's telling these stories, right? Who's getting to write about them? Who is controlling the narrative? And that's when I decided, okay, well, I'm going to take a stab at this. And my first attempt at writing was literally writing letters to the editors, trying to get them, raise awareness about these different issues. None of them ever got published because I was 14 and not a very good writer, but it set me on this journey of understanding the importance of storytelling. And so I continued with that. Where it also helped me was that when I went off to college at the University of Michigan, I didn't know what I was going to study because, to be honest with you, I didn't even know if I wanted to go to college because, as a first generation college kid, my mom didn't graduate high school. My dad had gone to community college for a couple semesters. Like I said, we had this really great restaurant. And I didn't know what my future was going to be, but my parents really felt that education was important. So they pushed me to go to college. And when I was there, that's when I discovered poetry writing, which is, a different side of writing and the importance of it. And I used writing as a way to sort of come to terms with not only my racial identity, but also coming out. I used it to talk about my feelings, people I was attracted to, and things like that. And so luckily, I got into the creative writing program at the University of Michigan. I graduated, and then I went off to New York. And I guess the rest is history. I've had a really good run as a writer. This past year, I worked on currently I'm working on projects for PBS. I've got a couple kid shows I'm working with for them. I'm working with Warner Brothers on a young teen drama. And just this past week, I started talking to the New York Times about doing a piece for them. And the Bon Appetit article that I wrote last year just got selected for Best American Food Writing. So I've had a pretty good run since COVID, with things. And in addition, on top of it, the biggest thing is that I sold my memoir called Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to read a excerpt from it. And then I'll open up the floor to Q&A. And if there's time, which I think we might have, then I'll read a second piece, which I think Will requested that I read. So I'll start off and reading this short section from the first part of the book. So the way I structured the book was 8 stories in elementary, middle school, 8 in high school, and 8 in college. And I did that because in Chinese superstition, 888 is a really good number. It's lucky. And so there are all kinds of little Easter eggs like that in the book. So I'm going to read from the first section of the book, which is when I am in middle school. So hopefully I can do well with the lighting here. Everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant. In Detroit, the Motown sound was everywhere. And in my mind, the one and only Diana Ross reigned supreme. Her sweet, youthful voice combined with her radiant smile served as an inspiration to me. In addition to sharing Chinese zodiac signs, the year of the monkey, we were from the same area. The international superstar had grown up blocks from our restaurant in the Brewster Douglas housing projects, the largest government-subsidized housing in Michigan. Though Ross's label Motown Records had abandoned the city a decade ago, I used to fantasize that one day the singer would make a splashy return and we'd share an order of egg rolls in our front booth. When I reached 7th grade, Diana's hit I'm Coming Out came bursting onto the airwaves. You guys all know the song, right? I'm coming out. It was a great song. I was 12, and the term coming out was new to me. I'd never heard it before. I thought it was cool, but I didn't think it had anything to do with being gay or lesbian. The lyrics were more universal. The song championed personal freedom and independence. I could definitely relate, as there were 4 adults in my house, each with 1,000 heavenly mandates. Whenever the song came on the radio, I cranked up the volume and channeled up my inner diva. Unfortunately, one morning, before we opened, as I sang along in the dining room, I had an unexpected audience. Derek, one of our younger waiters. A member of the Kung Fu Club, the John Travolta wannabe, had a ripped chest that he liked to show off by leaving a button or two undone. As I shook my booty and stretched my lips, pink chopstick in hand, he snuck up behind me, and when I turned around, he swished his hand from side to side. His limp wrist may not have been a motion in American Sign Language, but the gesture was so well known that even a Chinese waiter from Hong Kong understood what it meant. It meant fag. Thankfully, no one else was in the room, and Derek had the memory of a goldfish. He never brought up my dancing again, but his accusation put fear in me. No one in my family had ever said anything anti-gay, not even my grandma, who could spout some pretty offensive things about race and gender. But no one said anything positive about being gay either. That left a big question mark in my mind. How would they react if it turned out to be true, that I was like that? Back in the early 80s, the perception of gays and lesbians outside the major cities, pre-AIDS and pre-Pride parades, was much harsher, more toxic than it is today. There were no positive role models in music, television, or film. Homosexuals were lumped in with drug dealers, alcoholics, and pedophiles. There was no guarantee that things would get better. But despite my resistance and denial and the many cold showers I took, I couldn't ignore my growing attraction to boys. It happened too often to be a fluke or a one-off. Until I could figure out what this all meant, I needed space to sort it through. To buy myself time, I tried my best to blend in. After the close call with Derek, I paid more attention to the way my body moved in the world, how I walked and talked and ate and laughed. I started to notice how others were perceiving me too. While I didn't think I had any effeminate habits, I still tried to butch things up. No more frilly dancing to the Queen of Motown. I needed to find a strong, respectable male role model, preferably one who was straight. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead to part of the story. One potential role model came from the big screen. My parents were always busy with work, so I recall them taking us to the movies only once when I was around 10 or 11. My siblings and I were in the back kitchen, annoying my grandma just by breathing. After she complained to my dad, he suggested we go catch a show. I had to clean the wax out of my ears for that one. My mom looked up from her bowl of filling. Nope, we got to stay here. It wasn't that she hated movies. My mom loved them, especially the American ones she had watched with her siblings in Hong Kong. In fact, she named me after an actor in one of her favorite movies, the American drag comedy Some Like It Hot. The movie, starring square-jawed He-Man Tony Curtis, eluding an angry group of gangsters by disguising himself in an ill-fitted wig and a frumpy sundress. Basically, she'd named me after the worst drag queen ever. But as finance director of the family, my mom set the budget. Her priority was education, not entertainment. She never hesitated to take us to the teacher store, but we rarely set foot in a Toys R Us or a Harmony House. Movie theaters were a mystery too. All the first run houses were in the suburbs, and even the ticket price for the second run theaters in the city were too high for a family of 7. Besides, we had TV and that was free. My dad stacked up our school books. It's a weekend matinee. Tickets are half off. My sibling and I turned up the pressure. Please, we promise to be good. My mom turned to Chris, my older brother, as if he had a say. He was her sounding board on any potential social activity. He addressed its educational value. My brother, who wasn't a total dweeb, shrugged his shoulders in approval. My mom put down her bowl. Okay, but when we come back, we all have to do extra math problems. We cheered. I even patted Chris on the back. Star Wars, I screamed. That was a no-brainer for me. The international blockbuster had been out for months, but the kids at school were still raving about Han Solo this, Luke Skywalker that. I might have been late to the party, but I still wanted to join the rebellion. My dad had his own movie in mind. His face lit up. Let's go see Return of the Dragon. It's got Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee, no friggin' way, I thought. That guy was the worst. I hadn't heard his name in years, but at my old elementary school, the black and white boys used it as the punchline to every joke. Whenever they taunted me with their pseudo karate chops, they invoked his name. Show us your kung fu, Bruce. How high can you kick, Bruce? Crack this pencil with your flat face, Bruce. Unfortunately, everyone else was just happy to get out. Overruled, I grudgingly joined my siblings in the back of our van. The film was playing at the Fox Theater on Woodward Avenue. Built in the 1920s, the movie palace that had once housed stage shows with stars like Shirley Temple, Frank Sinatra, and even my mom's favorite, Elvis Presley, now survived on a rotation of Shaft and Superfly. We entered the cavernous interior, which had a strangely oriental motif. The design was amazing, even more ornate than the fine artwork we had at our restaurant. But there was little time to appreciate the grandeur before the lights dimmed. We grabbed the only open seats, which happened to be in the back row. I got a whiff of buttered popcorn, which smelled way better than the bag of dried chow mein noodles that my mom had snuck in. The movie began, and I slowly became a believer. Every time Bruce creamed one of his opponents, I slapped my knee hard. The whole audience must have agreed as the refreshments went flying. The final bout pitted Bruce's character against his arch rival, played by Chuck Norris. When he snapped his nemesis' neck, the theater burst out cheers. Go get him! Slap him, honky! I wasn't used to such loud reactions. I looked around and realized that everyone, except for us, in the theater was Black. I figured I should just follow the crowd. I jumped up and down. You show him, Bruce. Tell him who's boss. My mom yanked on my shirt. Sit down or we're not coming back. I tried to stay clear. I tried to stay seated, but I couldn't stop myself. The release of these pent-up emotions felt so liberating. Bruce wasn't like Arnold, the wacky Japanese-American diner on Happy Days, or Hop Sing from the reruns of Bonanza, or the clueless husband in the Calgon commercials. He was the big dog, and he got to kick ass. I made my family stay through the end credits. Then it was time to head back to study. The sidewalk was packed with moviegoers as we waited for my dad to get the van. I mimicked some of Bruce's best moves, a chop there, a kick here. Some of the fans outside the theater pointed at me and giggled. It felt like deja vu, the start of another playground putdown. I turned to my family for cover, but they were climbing into the van. I closed my eyes, bracing for the barrage of fake hayas. But the hits never came. I opened my eye and saw the expression on one of the boys, who was about my age. He was smiling. The tension in my shoulders dissolved as he and his friends pumped their fists in the air. Oh man, that movie was sick. You done killed it. Okay, it was kind of racist for them to assume I had anything to do with the movie. That would have been like me complimenting them for Diana Ross's The Theme from Mahogany. But it hit me that they were admiring Bruce, not mocking him. He was my man, but he was their man too. In a world with so few brown, black, or yellow stars, maybe it was okay for us to share our heroes. Okay, so that's one of the stories from the beginning of the book. And so at this point, I usually open up the floor to any Q&A that we might have. About writing, the process, what it was like growing up at that time. And then, I can read a second story a little bit later into this. So, any questions or thoughts?
Hello.
Hi.
I was wondering, when writing your book, how was the process of going back through your memories, trying to create the narrative of your life, splitting it up in 8 parts? I'm just wondering, how was that process of remembering?
Cool. Are you a writer yourself?
Not really much of a writer, but I'm just curious how
Okay.
that process looks.
Yeah. So for me, when I start a writing process, it just comes with a general idea, right? I don't have things formed out. And so what I generally like to do is I'll send myself an email with some initial thoughts. And so with this particular project, I put in the header the title, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, because I'd been traveling around doing a lot of speeches, a lot of film screenings and things like that. And I just noticed that a lot of times people were asking me the same questions about what it was like growing up in Detroit, what that experience was like. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, maybe there's a book here, right? Like I didn't have an idea like, oh, I'm going to write a book. It just sort of came out naturally. And so I wrote myself this email and I sent myself all these like anecdotes that I remembered and all the things that I remembered as a kid that I thought would make a good book. And they tended to be like more funny stuff, like, stuff that I would have put it like in a TV show, like in a sitcom type stuff. Like things like my grandma taking our pet turtles and boiling them and making us eat them for dinner, stuff like that. And so I started writing the book based off those notes. But it was difficult for me to find an agent, which is what you have to do to sell your book. You have to find a literary agent who will then shop it around to editors and things like that. The book wasn't selling. The agents that I was approaching would all say, like, oh, I really like the writing, but I don't know how I could sell this book. And it was only after COVID happened and we were forced to shut down and I was home in LA that I said, okay, well, I'm going to take this book seriously. At the same time, the George Floyd murder happened, right? And there seemed to be this conversation that was sort of happening in America, which was more about racial divisions, identity. And because of that, I thought like, okay, I make documentaries like that, right? Why don't I just write my book more like my documentary work that I do as opposed to more like the TV stuff I was doing? And when I shifted it to that tone, it just really took off. Like I had multiple agents pursuing me. Ultimately, the book sold in what was called an auction, between all the big houses in New York. It sold in like 3 weeks. So there was a giant bidding war for the book. So I think in some ways, it's like, as a writer, you start off with what you want to write or what you think might be interesting to people. But as you're writing it and you're trying to, stay engaged with the audience and other people, you start to realize that, okay, well, maybe there are other things that people might be interested in. So I would say that like out of that first email that I wrote to myself, only about 10% of that actually ended up being in the book, and so it seemed like people had this other idea of what what they wanted me to talk about. And I'm fine with that, right? Because, as a writer, you do have to engage with your audience. You have to think about like, what are the things, that they might be interested in reading about. So that's how it sort of happened. And then you work with your agent and they sort of work with you to decide which stories, might fit in. And then you work with your editor after it's been sold. And so the other thing I say is that, so in this book, I mentioned that there are 24 stories, 8 stories in each in each section. So that's 24 stories, but I have another 20 stories that I wrote that didn't get in. And if this book sells really well, I'll sell the other book as a book called Leftovers. So that's how, that's how this works. So, yeah. Hi.
When you're planning a book about your life, did you think it was important to tell it in chronological order, or did you decide what the theme would be and then put the stories in according to what your ultimate goal was?
So the structure that I have for the book, which is like 888, I did that about halfway through because I'm very superstitious, and I thought, because previously it was just going to be more like a Chinese menu. I mean, I do that a little bit, but even more so where it's like I would have appetizers and like each thing would have a small thing. That's how I was just going to do it. So it wasn't necessarily chronological, but I think that it was easier to follow this way. And then also the feedback that I was getting from writing groups. And even when, after I sold the book, I had more flashbacks in it, but the editor at Little Brown told me to get rid of the flashbacks and just do it all in chronological order. So, yeah, I think it's really hard with memoirs, right? Because you're just living your life and you don't know if there's necessarily an arc to it. But I think I lucked out in the sense that for me, I had a basic theme that I was trying to pursue in the book. And so I'll read you the first paragraph of the book. And so this is sort of the theme that I just sort of followed. Welcome to Chung's. Is this for here to go? Armed with a smile and a red waiter's jacket with a perpetual plum sauce stain, that's how my dad greeted any new face who entered the lobby of our popular Chinese restaurant in Detroit. Interestingly, my great-great-grandpa Gong Li had faced the same question in the late 1800s as he stood cold and alone on a rickety dock in Guangzhou, China, trying to decide his future and that of his young impoverished family, for here or to go. For here or to go, as I got older, it was a question I asked myself. So for me, one of the big themes or questions in this book is that this idea of, do you stay in a city that's crumbling, that literally is burning down around you, right? And people are getting murdered left and right. Or do you leave your family and go off and do your own thing? And if that means coming out, but at the same time, feeling this guilt of leaving your family behind. And that's the story that sort of, threads it along. And so there is a natural arc to it, because I do ultimately obviously make the decision that I have to leave Detroit in order to become the person I want to be. And so it's a parallel between that opening scene of like my great-great-grandfather standing on the dock in China and my parents taking me to, my family taking me to the train station in Detroit, Michigan Central, and saying goodbye to me and sending me off. It's kind of like a comparison between the two. So there's a natural arc to it. So I think chronologically, then it made sense, right? Because then you're following me through that journey.
Thank you, Curtis. I look forward to reading the book.
Oh, thank you.
Yes. I'm interested in this Vincent Chin connection. Like how has it influenced you? Would you say you're an activist? Is your literature part of that activism? Or how else did that tragedy affect you?
So the Vincent Chin case was a very, very big case, not just for our family, for me personally, but for the Asian American community nationally. It was a case that really galvanized people because before that, you know, a lot of times the communities were so small, they didn't really fight back. And with this case, we got the buy-in of different parts. And so as a kid, as a 14-year-old, seeing your community being attacked like that and seeing people energized, obviously it had an impact on me, right? It made me start thinking. But interestingly, it had maybe the opposite impact initially. So one of the things that I did, and this is all in the book, one of the things I did to sort of compensate for it is that one of the stereotypes of Asian Americans is that we're foreigners, right? That we're not really Americans, that our allegiance is not fully with America. So what did I do to combat that stereotype? I became a Republican, like a really, really awful, you know. So in the book, I call myself the Asian Alex P. Keaton. I don't know if that means anything. Okay, good. See, that joke, I can tell. And if you know it, then you have a certain age. But young people are like, who's that? You know, so I was like Alex P. Keaton, and I was terrible. Like I was senior class president of NHS. I founded the Young Republican Club. I campaigned to shut down the student smoking lounge. I kicked people out of clubs because they weren't. So I was not, you know. So that was my response. I was gonna, you know, I was gonna be an uber American, like waving the flag and all that kind of stuff. So it did impact me that way. And obviously, you know, as I got older and I started realizing, you know, that some of the policies and things like that didn't necessarily jive with my own personal perspective on these things. In particular, you know, I called like the 3 A's, right? It was apartheid was the first. So I'd gotten into this thing called Boy State. I don't know if you guys know what that is, where they select 2 people from each high school. And here I thought I was, oh, I'm Mr. Conservative, right? Going off to this government program. And it turned out that being a conservative in the suburbs of Detroit is not the same thing as being a conservative in the whole state of Michigan, because you've got all these people in the Upper Peninsula who are a little bit, you know, to the right of you. And so we would have these policy discussions. Like, for instance, I was saying the 3 A's. The first was apartheid, right? To me, it was clearly a racist, you know, policy, and I just didn't understand it. Meanwhile, you had people who were justifying it, saying, well, South Africa is the most economically successful country on the continent. How can you dispute that, right? I'm saying because it's racist and it's colonialistic. The second one was, interestingly, AIDS, right? Because at that time, the Republicans were pushing this policy, compassionate conservatism. And as a Buddhist, we're all about compassion. It made sense to me. Let's do this, right? But when you talk to these people, they obviously were not compassionate. They oftentimes blamed gay people for the disease that they were dying from. And so I didn't understand that. And the third was actually abortion, because as a gay guy, a closeted gay guy at that time, I didn't really care because I'm not going to get a girl pregnant. So I was being selfish. So I said, like, hey, I'll be pro-life. There's no skin off of my back to say that. But it was only after I went off to college and I met these 2 women down my hall who explained to me that, no, it's really more fundamental. It's just about controlling our own bodies, getting to decide what we want to do. And then I realized, oh, okay, well, as a gay man, that's exactly what I want to do too. I just want agency. I just want to be able to decide my own future. And that's when I switched over. So, you know, the Vincent Chin case obviously did impact me in that sense. You know, and that was, you know, when my first documentary was looking back on that case. And it has been something that has stuck with me, you know, throughout my life. It's a story that I've continued to go to, both for inspiration and just a reminder of you know, where we are as a community and how to move forward. So, thank you.
So you've written a memoir, and memoirs, like as a genre, are sort of inherently confessional. How does the process of writing and publishing a memoir compare to the process of like coming out? And how's it different?
Well, my coming out was a disaster that took place in a big boys. Hopefully this book would come off a little bit better than that. It is a confessional, but I'll be honest with you, I don't necessarily put all the worst things that happened. I feel like, memoirs are in a way it is your life and it is the general sweeps of it. And so if you pick and choose the incidents that sort of help shape that, and like I said, I knew 5 people that had been murdered, by the time I was 18. I didn't need to include all 5 murders in the book, but I included the 3 that had a pivotal, uh, you know, um, came at pivotal times in my life. Like, so for instance, Vincent Chin at the first, starting high school. But when I was about to graduate high school, one of our favorite customers, came in by himself all the time, ate by himself, said he was an ER doctor. That's why he had all these strange hours. But turned out he was actually a psychiatrist who was coming into our area to hire prostitutes. Was going to break off with this one girl. The pimp got so upset that he also took a baseball bat, bashed in his head, killed him, and then chopped up his body with a Ginsu knife and littered it all across the freeway up to northern Michigan. And after that, combined with the issue of AIDS, I really, at that point in my life, had thought that I wondered if I was going to live past the age of 30, right? Because there's so much death and destruction in my life that it's like, oh, well, that's the life expectancy of a gay man, right? 30 years old. Not that he was gay, but that's what I was thinking. And so that was an important point in my life, and that's why that murder. But there were a couple other people that I knew that died where just it didn't have as much. And so you pick and choose which ones. So yes, it is partly confessional, but it's not a full confessional. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't know how much to give away in the book. Okay, I won't. Some characters do bad things, but I don't have to list every bad thing that they do. Do you know what I mean? I think you can pick and choose the one that came at certain pivotal moments and how it advances the story. So yes, it is a confessional, but it's not necessarily a full confessional. And then the other thing too is that uh, people have asked me, it's like, well, it's a memoir. How did you remember all these scenes exactly like that, and all the dialogue? And this is the thing that I had to learn about memoir writing is that it's not a fully documentation because, a lot of it's your memory, right? And so memories are not perfect, but as long as you capture the essence of it, and this oftentimes relates to the characterization of people, or even more specifically, dialogue, right? Like, I don't remember exactly what my brother said to me, but I know he was mean, you know what I mean? And I know that he said awful things to me. And so I would put in what I think, plausibly he could have said at that moment in particular things. And so, yeah, that's how you create a memoir. And at the end of the day, you just have to walk away and say, like, is this generally what my life was about? Are these generally, what I learned and what I might want to pass on? But I don't claim that it's 100% accurate even, right? Because even in writing it, like I'll talk to people like my mom or my siblings and they'll be like, well, that's not how I remember it. So, yeah. So it's confessional, but not 100%. That's my short answer.
I kind of would. Oh, hello. Oh,
Hi.
gosh. I would like to hear your perspective on growing up Asian and also growing up gay, because in my experience, during my childhood, it was all about the Asian stereotypes that I got. And it wasn't until like high school and college I got comments about like being gay and stuff like that. But it was mainly just like with one Asian stereotype in particular, being feminine, being like emasculated. So growing up, did you get more comments about like Asian stereotypes, or since you were closeted or coming out, was it more about, like being gay?
Yeah, that's all in the book, about the stereotypes and how they play into each other, right? And I do talk about how like being Asian male, because we're not sexualized very early, right? People think of us just as nerds. In some ways, it gave me an opportunity to sort of stay in the closet because nobody was asking about my dating. No one was joking about stuff like that. And interestingly, I had a conversation with an Asian lesbian like a couple days ago when I was in Detroit, and she was telling me her experiences. And, it was just really interesting how the stereotypes that she encountered as a woman, where Asian women are over sexualized versus Asian were not. In some ways, I could, like I felt bad for her because she obviously had more to deal with versus I felt like, even for me, I had the safety of this closet. I could hide behind this, asexual imagery of an Asian guy. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but I used it to my advantage, right? Like if people aren't asking me, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to bring it up. But and I played into the stereotype of being, an Asian whiz kid, like, studying, doing really well in school and stuff like that. And so that provided me a certain amount of cover. How are we doing on time?
So I have a question.
Okay, sure.
You mentioned in one of your answers earlier that your memoir had an 888 structure. I don't know what that is, and I was hoping you could
Oh,
help me
Chinese people are
understand it.
very superstitious about everything, right? And so it just has to do with the sound of the word 888. When you say it in Chinese, it sounds like the same word as fortune or good luck, bot, bot, bot. You know what I mean? So that's why they, will do or say certain things. It's like the same way that the number 4 is bad luck because it sounds like death. So you don't do certain things like that. So there are all kinds of like little Easter eggs in the book about like Chinese culture that hopefully you'll pick up if you're in the know about like, oh, that's very Chinese to do that, or that's very Buddhist to do that. It's something that I was trying to do. Because as writers of color, one of the things they talk about is this idea of the white gaze, in the past, where it's like whenever we write stories, we always have to take into account how white people are going to read or consume this material because they are oftentimes the biggest readership of things, right? So we have to factor that in. But there's this growing movement amongst writers of color to not necessarily always do that, right? And not to have to translate literally even in books, because in the past you would have something maybe written in a different language like Chinese, Japanese, or whatever, and then you'd immediately have to put in parentheses or something what it meant, or you'd have to put it in quotations or italics or something like that. But now there's a movement that you don't do that, and you just blend right in, and you literally leave it up to the reader, no matter where they're coming from, to sort of meet the writer where the writer's at, right? And so I think that's a refreshing moment. And so within this book, I think there's a lot of things that maybe, like if you were like a gay Chinese kid from Detroit, you might pick up a few more little things than if you weren't. So, yeah. So it's kind of nice to be able to have that little private in-jokes and stuff like that. Yeah.
It's on. Okay. I have a question about religion. You mentioned you're a Buddhist. When you were an uber Republican, how did you get around that?
Well, I'm a Buddhist, but I'm not a very good Buddhist. I should say that. And you don't have to be because we're not as strict about tenets and things like that. So the way I sort of looked at religion and how religion impacted my growth and my identity and, my family's coming up is that I was a Republican, and it wasn't just, and my move away from the Republicans wasn't, just about the specific policies, but in general, it was actually more about the way they perceived and they approached life. Because, with Buddhism, we're taught like, it's more about the gray area. You know what I mean? It's the compromise, it's all these kind of things. And so like, I think that part of the problem with politics in America right now is not just because of policies that have come out of the religious right, but a general way that they view the world, which is good and evil. Like you hear this term evil to describe the Democrats all the time now, right? That's a very religious, terminology, right? This idea that there's good and bad, it's very stark. And when you work in a democracy, you really can't have that. Democracies are about compromise, right? It's about listening to the other side. It's about like taking in account different opinions, right? And so I kind of say in the book, it's like we need to move away from that religion, maybe more towards Buddhism, which is more about compromise and like more yin yang. We need a little more yin yang in the politics of America, because that is something I wanted to do with this book. Is that, and when I pitched to my agent, I said that we live in a very divided world right now, right? We have these little silos where people don't talk to each other, between the right and the left, et cetera. But Chinese restaurants are actually one of the few places where maybe you might go in and you'll see people from a different racial background, different class background, different religious background. And so I want to take that opportunity to have these conversations, which are really important in our country, but hopefully you can do it in a way that is not polarizing people. So I said to my agents, we'll pitch it as come for the Chinese food, but stay for the talk on racism, as a way to sort of like bring people in. Because in a small way, I do want my book to help, heal our country, if I can, in a small way. I know there will be some people who will never pick it up just because they don't want to read about a gay Asian kid or whatever, but maybe there are enough people out there who are curious enough, and even people from the other side of the political spectrum, you know what I mean, who might say like, okay, let me see, how, what people are thinking, or how these other lives might be led, and how that might impact why they think a certain way. So at least it's my hope. If there's not another question, I can actually read another section, and then maybe you guys might have more questions. Right? When does this session end?
11:45, and
Okay, yeah.
I do
So-
have a question,
Oh,
if
you have a
you,
question. Okay, ask a
if you
question.
don't mind.
Okay, yeah.
So in Tennessee today,
Mhm.
right now,
Mhm.
within the LGBTQ community, there are a lot of people who are looking to move. Everywhere, everywhere I go, there are people talking about leaving the state for their own safety. As a person who left Detroit, as a person who has family members who left, how do you know when to go? How do you know when it's too much, it's too unsafe? What advice would you give to the queer community here in Middle Tennessee that is feeling unsafe and wondering if now is the time to go, or if they should stay and fight?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I don't know if you'll ever reach 100% certainty about what that answer is, because even now, every time I go home, I wonder how my life would have been different if I'd stayed. And really specifically, so part of when I switched from working, I still do TV stuff now, but I do it more at the development level. Like I'm oftentimes just working with companies at the executive level. But before, when I used to work on shows, I'd have to be in Burbank and stuff like that. And so I was working actually for a Disney Channel show at the time, and then my parents were in a car accident back home in Detroit, and sadly my dad died, and I had to go back home. And I guess out of all the 6 siblings, they deemed being a TV writer as the least important, like in terms of, okay, you stay behind and you take care of all this stuff. And so I stayed home in Detroit to sell the family restaurant, the place that I loved so much that I, even now I still miss, and I had to sell the home. My mom moved out to California to be with my brother, who was a doctor. And so when I was back there, I really was pondering whether or not I could take over the family restaurant. Could I leave Hollywood and just stay back in Detroit? And the Disney Channel kept calling my agents, asking me to come back because they wanted to put me on another show. But, I frankly was not in the mood to like tell jokes or to, pitch funny story ideas. And so that's when I compromised and I said, I'm going to make a documentary. And that's when I switched into social justice documentary work. But it's a question that I still, even every time I just came home I was just in Detroit before I came here. And I went to all my favorite restaurants that are still there. My great grandmother is still technically, my great grandmother is still alive. And I should say she's technically my great grandmother. She's my, I was gonna say she's technically alive, but no, she's technically my great grandmother. She's my great grandfather's 3rd wife. So she's still around. I went to her restaurant. I'm always still, I will always still feel like a Detroit writer. I always feel like a Midwesterner. I'll always want to go back. I do have questions about, now that I've left and I've been gone for decades, how much I can still stake claim to that idea of being a Detroit writer. I mean, how well do I really know? So, but it's a thought that I still always wonder. And I don't know if there's ever an easy answer. because I love my hometown. I wish I could have stayed. I wish there were opportunities there. But there just weren't. I just didn't see a pathway. And I certainly feel like the life that I have now where you know, um, I've had some really great experiences. I don't know if any of that would have happened if I'd stayed in Detroit, to be honest with you. So it's bittersweet. As for you guys here in Tennessee, I know you guys are under a lot of barrage and you kind of have to just make that personal decision. I do think it would be sad if everybody left because we do have to, fight, in every place. And I do think that these things are cyclical. And so maybe it is about sticking out these next couple years and maybe things will get better, right? Maybe a couple election cycles. But you have to make that choice for yourself, I think, ultimately. But I hope people stay. Yeah. Okay, I can read a quick short passage. This is actually from the high school years now. Okay. And again, I'm going to have another old reference, so hopefully old people will laugh, please. So my first boyfriend, so this is chapter 7 in the second section. My first boyfriend was the scion of a wealthy oil family in Denver. Though Stephen Carrington and I lived in different states, and he was a fictional TV character, the two of us had a standing date every Wednesday at 10 p.m. While I sat at the back of our restaurant chomping on egg rolls and fried rice, my dream catch frolicked in his palatial mansion, feasting on steak and caviar. Our worlds might have been different, but it felt reassuring to know someone else struggled, like me, to accept his homosexuality. When the producers of Dynasty announced the addition of another stud to their stable, I went berserk. Hollywood heartthrob Rock Hudson, with his chiseled good looks, epitomized the all-American sex gods. Unfortunately, when his character finally appeared on screen, his face looked gaunt and pale. Gone were the dazzling dimples and hunky body that had made the country swoon. It reminded me that youth and physical beauty were short-term visitors. Rumors swirled about Rock being sick with AIDS. In the heartland of the country in the mid-1980s, not much was known about the disease that was ravaging gay communities on both coasts. Any infected person seemed to be dead within days or weeks. My fear of coming out no longer centered on being disowned. They were about dying. It didn't matter that I was still a virgin and had said no to drugs. The corridor was filled with high-risk individuals, gays, druggies, prostitutes. As a science geek wannabe, I wanted to find the cause and cure. The textbooks in school were outdated, and the humongous card catalog at the Detroit Public Library had no new entries. The newspapers in our dining room became my primary source. It was rarely treated as front-page news, so I had to scour every section to find any info. Whenever a headline appeared, my initial excitement would wither with the details. Not even the initial report that Asians and Italians were immune to the disease made me feel better. The fake news only increased my fears about coming out. So, how are we doing on time? Do you guys have questions? If not, I'll continue. Okay. I'll continue. Okay. One night at the restaurant, my mom and I were on duty. It was my senior year in high school. She again pestered me for updates on my college plans. I'm still thinking, I said. That was true. With applications costing as much as $100 each, I had to be strategic. 2 Kroger's shopping bags full of brochures sitting in the corner of my bedroom made my choice difficult. The images seemed nice enough, but I couldn't picture myself on any of these green and ivy campuses. I figured it was like love. I would know the right suitor when he came along. As I flipped through the latest batch of competitors, the TV teased an upcoming report on funding for AIDS. My ears perked up. It had been a while since I'd heard any news about research or stats. The lack of information only made me think the worst. I looked forward to the update, but I couldn't show too much interest. My mom was sitting right next to me, and I was so deep in the closet that I didn't even want to hear the word rainbow. In those days, gays and lesbians received little support as a protected class, especially among members of my political party. The GOP didn't understand why the government should be doing anything to help these sinners. Some politicians felt that the gays were getting what they deserved. I wanted to bury my head in the sand, too, but I was not budging from the chair. Any abrupt exit would have drawn too much attention. As usual, the report began with a photo of some random white guy wasting away in the hospital. The more handsome he was, the sadder the image. It was strange. I was in high school and constantly thinking about death. Why? It was scary to see so many young men dying, but to me, it was even scarier to see them dying by themselves, no loved ones surrounding them with love and support. That was my biggest fear. I didn't care how I went, AIDS, gunshot, overdose. I just didn't want to die alone. The story switched to the meat of the piece. While the bipartisan Congress had allocated $190 million for research, much more than his administration's request, President Reagan was missing in action. The world was 4 years into this epidemic with thousands dead, and he was still having trouble even mentioning the word. Maybe the great communicator needed to be pulled aside and given speech lessons. When the segment ended, I searched my mom's face for her reaction. I wanted Sorry, the lighting is bad. I wanted any clues to her views on AIDS and, by extension, homosexuality. The fact that she didn't flinch or throw up was a good sign. Maybe there was hope. Once again, my party politics forced me to proceed with caution, but I was too curious and optimistic not to ask. So what do you think? My mom paused, then offered a frown. He's your president. He's everyone's president, I said. Then he should act like it. I couldn't agree more, but I was handcuffed. The closet made me say things I didn't truly believe. I responded, he's busy fighting the Russians. What do you want him to do? My mom shook her head. Help. It was a simple word, help. My mom's answer surprised me. Personal responsibility had been her mantra. She'd always taught us to depend on ourselves, no handouts. But here she seemed to be saying that it was okay to help, to seek help from the government. In some cases, maybe even necessary. Was she reevaluating the idea of welfare lines too? Was my independent mom becoming a bleeding heart liberal? Okay, that's it. So that, again, sort of shows the evolution of me coming to terms with some of these things that I had to deal with as a kid. So that is my book, and it's coming out in October. It's gotten a really great response so far. Like I said, you know, it's going to have a big tour in the fall. And so right now I've just been sort of traveling around talking about the book. I even already have interest in far away. Like, so I'm going to Europe in May because I have 3 talks in the Netherlands and 2 in Germany about the book already. You know, so yeah, hopefully it's going to be a big book. So any more questions?
So, hello? Okay. So a lot of younger LGBT people didn't grow up when HIV/AIDS was intense as it was back then. However, we have sort of lived through another pandemic, which is COVID. Like, we see historically a lot of the blame for HIV/AIDS was placed on the gay community, and in the present day, we see a lot of like the blame for COVID placed on Asian minorities. Like, what sort of parallels or lessons do you think we can sort of take from like this?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I mean, I feel like there's a couple of things. I'd also want to turn it back on you and asking it as a younger gay person. I mean, do you have an interest in what people, say my generation, went through? Because I thought about that as I was writing the book, because, you know, of the younger gay people that I know, like, you know, they have things like PrEP, they have safe sex. I mean, all these things, they don't mean anything to them. Or even the idea of marriage equality is something they've grown up with their whole life. They don't know anything about the struggles that people of my generation, you know, had gone through, or in Will's generation. And, you know, I was sort of split down the middle on that. One half of me was thinking, it's good that they don't know, right? Because isn't that the goal of civil rights, is to move forward and to move beyond the struggles of the past? And isn't it great that young people don't have to worry about these things that we had to worry about? But then the other half of me was like, bullshit, they should know. It was damn tough, you know, at that time. And I sort of just reconciled it to be like, okay, it is going to be what it is. If young gay people want to read my book, fine. If they don't, ultimately, I think that there's enough people from my own generation who might still be curious, right, about it. But, you know, now that we have seen the rise of, you know, the backlash in the last couple of years, particularly against drag performers and like other legislation in anti-trans legislation, I think it is important that they know that history. And so I do think that hopefully young people, whether they are curious about it or whether they're pushed to read stories about what people of our generation went through. I do think it's important, not only because, they can learn from it, I think in some ways, because there are parallels, like you were saying, but also because I think it sends a positive message that we are moving in the right direction, right? Is that even though there seems to be some steps being taken back now, ultimately we are moving forward, and there are a lot of basic stuff that we fought for that I don't think we'll ever go back to. Do you know what I mean? Whether it was overturning, and this is much before my time, but the idea of homosexuality as a mental illness, right? Each of our generations have surpassed something, which hopefully will never be taken away. And some things will be, but hopefully in general, we're moving forward in that. So that's what I would hope. But in terms of the parallel, you're right, because people have asked me about that. And I've said, yeah, as a gay person, we went through a pandemic before. And in some ways we were better prepared for it. And people, I think they were cited stats that showed that gay people actually were in the beginning, we were the highest group to get vaccination because we understood the whole process, because so many of us had gone through the fight to get things approved by, the FDA and stuff like that. And we even dealt with Anthony Fauci back back in the 80s, because he was also the villain back then. I mean, there's so many parallels. And you're right, as a double minority who was actually, blamed back then as a gay person and now being blamed as an Asian, it's like, I do understand the parallels between that. If it's not you one time, it's going to be you the next time too. So it's like, yeah. That's why intersectionality is important. So. Any other questions, thoughts?
I want you to join me in thanking
Thank-
Curtis Chen for coming and speaking today. Give him a
Thank you
round
so
of
much.
applause.
Shameless plug. The book is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all these other great places. So please pre-order. It's very important as a writer to have books pre-ordered, because then it sends a message to the publishing company that people are interested in our books, right? Because, just because I sold my book doesn't mean they're going to buy another book by another queer writer, another Asian writer. We have to prove it. And, I'm hoping to have a moment where this book is a big seller, so that will open up the doors for other people to also sell their books. So thank you.
On behalf of the conference,
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you so much
Oh, thank you.
for today, for coming and speaking to us today. I really
Appreciate it. Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Okay.
Hello. I want to thank you for being part of this so far today, and I invite you to join us as we move next door for the lunch break, networking, and religious and community